So dear friends, we will go to the last unit. The last unit is critical thinking. And this is, in my opinion, this is one of the key attributes. And that is why I have devoted an entire unit to the discussion of critical thinking. Now, if you ask me, what is the major difference or what is the fundamental student between a bright student and an average or a mediocre or a below average or a below mediocre student? That is question number one. Question number two, what is the difference between, let us say, an American student or a French student or a German student or an Italian student from good universities in Europe and in North America, and the Indian student? So we have two questions. So the first question is the difference between a bright student and a dull student or a mediocre student, and the difference between, a key difference between Indian students on the one hand and their North American or the European counterparts. Now, I would say you can think of many answers. I can also think of many answers, but in my opinion, in my perspective, one of the key answers or one of the key differences between a bright student and a poor student, between Indian students and their American counterparts or their European counterparts would be critical thinking, which means a bright student is able to think critically, whereas a mediocre student is not able to think critically. Now, you look at North American students, particularly students at Yale or Harvard or Princeton or Columbia. Now, they stand out. And if you ask me, like, why do they stand out? Like, what is their special attribute? We can talk of many key attributes, but one of the key attributes is these students, the Yale University students or the Harvard University students or the University of Oxford students or the University of Cambridge students, they are good at critical thinking. They look at everything critically. They possess enormous amount of critical thinking. Now, unfortunately, the Indian students, they lack critical thinking, and that is why I have devoted an entire unit to the discussion of critical thinking. So we will start with a very basic question. What exactly is critical thinking and how do we define critical thinking? So I have given you 5 definitions of critical thinking. All of them are very brief. And that is why I have given you 5 definitions of critical thinking. But in addition, I would like to introduce this particular book. Maybe some of you are already aware of it. The title of the book is CT. CT stands for Critical Thinking. Critical Thinking and Introduction. It was published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. The author is Alex Fisher. So dear friends, if you have a chance, I am sure this book is available in your library. So please go through this book. This book is very resourceful. In the initial chapters, it talks about critical thinking, and in the rest of the book, the last 10 chapters or so, he talks about ways and means in which critical thinking could be developed, how to develop inductive thinking, how to develop critical thinking, how to develop deductive thinking, how to develop inferential thinking. So all these are talked about in individual chapters with a lot of examples. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the definitions of critical thinking. So let me restrict myself to the first definition, that is by Fisher, taken from his book Critical Thinking and Introduction. So he would define critical thinking as the ability to interpret, analyze, evaluate ideas and arguments. Okay, so what are the key words? You have to interpret. I suggest a book. So what do? You go through the book and then you don't take in whatever the author has said. You try to analyze, you try to evaluate. Is it good? Is it bad? Has it been argued convincingly? Are the conclusions, are the inferences logical? Has he given evidence for whatever he has suggested? as he backed his theory with arguments, with evidence. So, in other words, critical thinking is the ability to interpret, to analyze, to examine, to evaluate, to probe ideas, arguments, theories, etc. So, that is the definition of critical thinking. Now, there is another way of looking at critical thinking, and how do we look at critical thinking from another point of view? So please look at this. The first line would summarize what is the first line. So what is critical thinking? Asking questions. I listen to a lecture and then I ask questions. I read a book. I ask questions. I watch a movie. I ask questions. I have a conversation with a colleague or a friend. I ask questions. So, what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is asking questions. But what kind of questions? You have to ask the right questions. You have to ask the critical question. You have to ask a reasonable question. You have to ask a logical question. So, in other words, if you are a critical thinker, basically you are a skeptic. You don't agree with whatever the book says. You don't agree with whatever the author says. You don't agree with whatever the author says. You don't agree with whatever the speaker says. You look at him, you listen to him with a lot of skepticism. Why? You need to ask questions to find out more about a particular topic, to know more about an event, to know more about an experiment, to know more about a phenomenon, to know more about a book, to know more about a lecture. Only by asking questions, only by asking critical questions, then you get more ideas and you arrive at satisfactory or adequate conclusions and results. In other words, what is critical thinking? Interrogating, critiquing, deconstructing a position or a stance and take a stand of your own. What is critical thinking? Thinking skeptically, not for the sake of doubting, not for the sake of questioning, so that you're able to support all claims with adequate, with satisfactory evidence and proof. In other words, you're being objective, you're being impartial, you're being reasoned, you're being logical. In other words, critical thinking is thinking about thinking. To put it in very simple language, you read a book, you listen to a lecture, you watch a video, you watch a movie. You don't take in, you don't accept everything that the movie says, everything that the book says, everything that the author says, everything that the speaker says. You interrogate, you question, you critique, you deconstruct, and then find out if the arguments have been supported by solid evidence. If the arguments have not been supported by solid evidence, then you discard it. Yes, the arguments have been supported by solid evidence, by adequate evidence. Then you accept these arguments. So the next question is why? Why do we need critical thinking? Why should we develop our own critical thinking, and why should we develop the critical thinking of our students? Now, I think of three reasons, two academic and the third one is beyond academic. So what are the academic reasons as to why we need to develop our critical thinking? To know more about the subject, I would like to know more about Shakespeare. I would like to know more about Milton. I would like to know more about a particular theory in life sciences or physics or chemistry. I would like to know more about the contributions of the Nobel Prize winner in medicine, or I would like to know more about the coronavirus. So, in order to know more about the subject or a phenomenon, you need to ask the right questions. You need to ask the critical questions, because only when you ask questions will you get answers. Okay, so the second one, today we are bombarded with a lot of fake news, distorted news, unauthenticated news, not only news but unauthenticated online materials, people who spew venom on TV with a lot of cultural prejudice, linguistic prejudice, religious prejudice. So critical thinking will help you not only to detect, but to set aside, but to reject fake news, distorted perceptions, and ultimately if you are a critical thinker, if you are endowed with critical thinking abilities, that helps you to take better decisions in life. Okay. Now, in this particular slide, I would like to talk about what are the qualities of a critical thinker. Am I a critical thinker? If so, do I possess these qualities? Do I possess these attributes? If not all these attributes, or at least most of these attributes, if you claim to be a critical thinker, if you claim to be endowed with critical thinking abilities or critical thinking skills, do you possess all these qualities? Do you possess all these attributes? So we will run through the list. So the question is, what are the qualities of a critical thinker? So the first quality is you should be honest and committed to truth, not half truth, not partial truth, not distorted truth, whatever may be the subject. I am committed to truth. Okay, so you look at Socrates, you look at Plato, you look at Aristotle, they were all committed to truth. Socrates to the extent of sacrificing his own life. So the most important quality of a critical thinker is he or she should be honest and should be committed to truth. You pursue truth relentlessly. The second one, you should have the ability, you should have the capacity, you should have the capability to not only gather information or evidence about a particular subject or about a particular topic or about a particular phenomenon, but you should also have the capacity to analyze, to sift, to unravel the data that we have collected as far as that particular subject or that particular phenomenon or theory is concerned. Then you also have the ability to arrive at right conclusions. Conclusions, and when do they become right conclusions? Satisfactory conclusions when they lead logically, either inductively or deductively, inferentially, based on strong evidence. Then if you are a critical thinker, you will be open to other ideas, other perspectives, other standpoints. Okay, so you're able to look at things from the other's point of view. Then you have the willingness and humility to listen to others and their viewpoints. Not that you're arrogant and then you say, no, what I say is right. I can give you a lot of examples, particularly from TV personalities who claim, who proclaim that only what he says is right and all the others are fools. No, a critical thinker is one who is willing and has humility in abundance to listen to others and recognize and value the viewpoints of others. Be aware of and critique your own biases, your own prejudices. All of us have biases, linguistic, religious, cultural. So if I am a critical thinker, the first thing is I should become aware of my own biases and prejudices. And once I become aware of my own biases and prejudices, then I should take steps to eliminate or to discard or at least lessen those biases and prejudices. And a critical thinker is willing to relook or to revisit decisions taken in the light of fresh evidence and fresh argument. So if there is new evidence, if there is fresh evidence, then you have the humility, you have the willingness to go back, to relook, to revisit your point of view, and then you take decisions in the light of the new evidence or the fresh evidence. So dear friends, this is my last slide. Now I would like to begin the discussion of this particular slide with two important questions, two crucial questions. And what are the two important questions? Now I would like to ask, what would be the major difference between, let us say, bright students, intelligent students on the one hand, and average or mediocre students on the other? So that is my first question. My second question is, now let us compare the Indian students with, let us say, their American counterparts or their European counterparts. Now, a student studying at, let us say, Yale University or Columbia University or Harvard University, how is he or she different from, let us say, a student studying in an Indian college or an Indian university? So we will talk about it very briefly. Now, as far as I am concerned, the major difference between a bright student and a mediocre student, and the major difference between, let us say, an Indian student and an Ivy League student would be an Ivy League student or a bright student in India would be a student with a lot of critical thinking skills. In other words, the line of demarcation would be the amount of or the degree of the percentage of critical thinking skills a student possesses. So you go to North American universities or you go to some of the best European universities. When I visited some of the best North American universities and the European universities, what I found was, what was striking to me was the kind of questions they ask in the class, the kind of questions they raise in a debate. In other words, the amount of critical thinking skills that they have or they possess. But unfortunately, you look at the Indian system of education, particularly at the primary and at the secondary level, it is all rote memory. Our students are trained to memorize, but unfortunately, our students are not trained to ask questions. So we do not interrogate, we do not ask, we do not critique. Instead, we memorize. And therefore, the critical thinking skills of our students are only average or even below average. So therefore, the point that I would like to talk about is, as teachers, whether we are chemistry teachers or mathematics student teachers or commerce teachers or sociology teachers or philosophy teachers, as teachers, what can we do and we what should we do to improve our students' critical thinking skills or critical thinking abilities? I would like to talk about 6 points, and with that I'll finish the discussion. So the first one, the class, the transaction inside the classroom could be in the form of questions and answers. Instead of the teacher talking all the time, instead of a monologue, it could be at least occasionally, if not the entire 45 minutes or the entire 60 minutes, at least on and off, the classroom could be converted into a question and answer session or a platform. So in other words, as teachers, we should regularly ask questions and we should wait patiently for answers, whether it is a correct answer or a satisfactory answer. First, let students listen to the question and give us some answers. So we will not reduce the class to a soliloquy or a monologue, but at least occasionally, let there be questions and answers. Let there be a dialogue. The second point, as teachers, what should we do? Encourage students to ask questions. Now, unfortunately, in the Indian tradition, like, we are not supposed to question the guru. We are supposed to revere the guru, but not differ with the guru's point of view. We do not question, we do not interrogate, we do not deconstruct the guru's opinions or perspectives or philosophy. So in the classroom also, this practice continues. Most of our students, they do not ask any questions. So we need to encourage, motivate, inspire students to ask questions. The third one is, periodically, as teachers, we should arrange for group discussions to debate key issues, to debate the lessons, to debate insights. Okay, then the fourth one, this is the most important one. We should discourage and devalue rote memory, especially in exams. And what can we do? In humanities, in art subjects, as far as the exam system is concerned, as far as the assessment pattern is concerned, we can opt for more open-ended questions rather than closed-ended questions. And in sciences, particularly pure sciences, physical sciences, natural sciences, in terms of assessment, we can opt for more problem-solving questions. In other words, the last 3 points, discouraging and devaluing rote memory, particularly in exams, and promoting open-ended questions and promoting problem-solving questions. I'm basically referring to Bloom's taxonomy, because Bloom says, he talks about 6 different skills and he divides them, he categorizes them into lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills. He says remembering, understanding, and applying, they are not higher order thinking skills. So what are higher order thinking skills according to Bloom and Bloom's taxonomy? It is creating, evaluating, analyzing. Okay, so based on that, we will try to promote the critical thinking abilities of our students. In other words, and this is how I would like to conclude the fourth unit, which is on critical thinking skills. So in other words, we will not follow or we will discard, we will junk the banking model of education that has been talked about by Paulo Freire in his very famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And instead, we will promote, we will encourage the Socratic method of education. So very briefly, what is this banking model of education that we need to discard? And what is this Socratic or the Maieutic method of education that we need to promote ardently? So in the banking model of education, in the banking concept of education, what happens is the student is considered as an individual who knows nothing, and the teacher periodically deposits not knowledge but pieces of information in the minds of students, which are considered tabula rasa, empty slates. And this information is retrieved. So there is no processing of information, and it remains information, and it is not processed and converted into knowledge. So this is the problem with the banking model of education. Students' minds are considered empty, tabula rasa, and the teacher deposits pieces of information and they remain as information, and they are not processed into knowledge. Whereas in the Socratic method of education, Socrates says the teacher is a midwife, the teacher is a catalyst. Okay, Socrates uses the metaphor of midwife. That is why it is known as the Maieutic method of education. So what does a midwife do? She doesn't deliver, she doesn't give birth. Somebody else delivers a baby, but what the midwife does is she assists in the delivery of the baby. So the teacher should assist in the delivery of knowledge. The students know, they have some information, they have some knowledge, maybe peripheral knowledge. Okay, so it is the duty of the teacher to act as midwives and elicit more information from the students by asking questions, by asking right questions. So dear friends, that marks not only the end of the fourth unit, but by entire presentation. So let me quickly summarize. My presentation was titled graduate attributes, and I had divided my presentation into 4 units. In the first unit, which was general in nature, I answered the question, what are graduate attributes? What are the key graduate attributes, and how do we classify or categorize the graduate attributes? Then in the second part of the presentation, I talked about very briefly the 12 key graduate attributes with a little explanation for each of the 12 key graduate attributes. Then in the third unit and in the fourth unit, I focused on 2 graduate attributes, which in my opinion are important and relevant, particularly for the times that we are living in. So in the third unit, I talked about EI, emotional intelligence. I answered questions like what is emotional intelligence, and what are the 3 models of emotional intelligence? What are the advantages of having a good or a high emotional intelligence? And as teachers, what can we do to promote the emotional intelligence of our students? And in the last unit, I talked about critical thinking skills and abilities. I defined what is meant by critical thinking, and what are the advantages of critical thinking and how to promote critical thinking abilities. So once again, dear friends, nice meeting all of you virtually. And I thank the principal of Ramanujan College, Delhi, Dr. Agarwal, and my friends Dr. Lata and Dr. Nirmalia for having given me this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas on graduate attributes with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.